When I was a teenager, I played chess at a chess club. My father's a very good chess player. I am not. And one day I was reading a book on opening theory and kind of looking at and trying to memorize some relevant opening strategy. My father comes in and asks what I'm doing, and I tell him, and he says, if you want to be a better player, stop making mistakes. That's a fundamentally useful piece of advice for any board game. If you make fewer mistakes, you will win more often. It's more important than tactics. It's more important than strategy. It's more important than rote learning. Making an error you know is an error and then going, oh damn, I left my piece where it can be captured, is going to cost you more games than any of those things are going to win you. So today, I want to talk about the most common unforced error in unconditional surrender. That is the equivalent of leaving a piece en prise in chess, or simply failing to take a 3-point road when you could in Carcassonne. And that is the supply trap. The supply rules in unconditional surrender are very generous. You need, as is traditional in most hex and counter war games, to be able to draw a continuous line of hexes to a supply source for your unit. In this case, a supply source is any unconquered city in the home country of the unit. Except for the very first hex that passes through, it has to follow a road or a rail link. And it is not allowed to pass through an enemy zone of control unless the hex that the zone of control is exerted on contains a friendly unit or city. However, here's where it's very generous. Supply is only checked once in each turn, and that's after your side's movement. That means the enemy cannot just suddenly move and cut your supply off, which is a very common feature of a lot of games. It's also the case that being out of supply doesn't instantly kill you, though it is pretty bad. Well, let's take a look at the overall map. If you look at the whole map and you begin to look at it in detail, I think it's the case that every single hex that a unit can be in on the entire map, with the exception of a few islands, is within 2 hexes of a rail or road link, and therefore is in principle supplyable. So again, it's very generous as a game in that respect. However, there is the supply trap. So what is a supply trap? Well, this position here, unfortunately, I'm sorry about this. I would have liked to have shown you actual screenshots of the game in action, but the replay function on Board Game Arena is basically offline for unconditional surrender. I can make it work for recent training scenarios, so if I've just done a training solo scenario, I can then replay bits of that. But for any game of any length, the logs are being truncated and they're usually being lost for some reason. So until Board Game Arena sorts that out, this kind of thing will have to be done just with screenshots. Look at the US Army. The US Army has the option of advancing after combat, and it's great. It gets it to the other side of the Alps and right on the doorstep of Munich. This is a good position. Except, in its current position, it has supply. That is, you can trace a line back to the British Expeditionary Force to the southwest, because you can be in a zone of control if there is a friendly unit there. And then you can trace from there southeast back onto the rail link, and that can then pass back through the 10th Garrison and down through the cities, off down the link in Italy, and it will go to a transport, and the transport will connect it back to the US. But if it takes that advance after combat, it won't be in supply any longer. And that feels kind of odd because the square it will leave behind is not actually in a zone of control, but the rail link that it's currently sitting on is blocked to its southeast by the Bulgarian unit because there's no friendly unit in that space. You can't trace supply along that rail link. You need to trace it back through the British Expeditionary Force. But the British Expeditionary Force is not in a space that contains a road or rail link, and you can only trace through one hex of that type in order to get back to a road or rail link before you trace the rest of your supply. So if it advances, it goes out of supply. And this is the supply trap. It's a situation in which a move will take you from a position where you are in supply to a position where you are out of supply, and it is easy for you to simply not spot that that's going to happen. Now, in a friendly face-to-face game with actual counters, I don't think supply traps would be as big an issue. Your opponent might let you take the move back. They might point it out to you because the two of you might be looking and discussing the board at the same time. They might not spot that you don't have supply, and if you don't know you don't have supply, then the two of you might simply assume the unit is supplied and carry on through the supply phase. But once you have a computer acting as an impartial and completely accurate arbiter of this, then you get a problem. In BGA, what happens is you do your moves, then you end the phase, then the supply phase kicks in, and then you discover you're out of supply. And suddenly you can't do anything about it. You've fallen into a supply trap. What I'm going to do is I'm going to present you with examples of these that illustrate how they occur. If you spot them on your turn, supply traps are rarely dangerous. So here is the end of the Allied turn. You can see that they're still fighting in southern France. Can you spot the supply trap? And can you fix it? If you want to, I'm going to give a little pause after I introduce ones like this so that you can, if you want, stop the video and have a go yourself and see if you can work out where the supply trap is and whether or not you can fix it. Okay, so the supply trap is with the 8th Army between Milan and Venice. The units in Milan and Venice are exerting zones of control which form a solid line, and the 8th Army can't draw its supply back through that solid line. Can you fix it? Yes. There are conceivably two ways to do this. You can take the one unactivated American unit and you could attack Venice. If you succeed in taking Venice, then the 8th Army will be able to draw a supply line back. However, your odds of doing that are only about 1 in 6 because the Americans have run out of air support in the area. The other way of doing it is the American unit can go around and cross the Po and use itself to form a supply link back through the friendly city. Friendly cities and friendly units protect supply lines. This will hold the supply for the turn. It will immediately allow the German unit in Venice to come round and capture the city to the south. So, it's not good, but this is one of the places where the supply system is quite generous. If you hold supply at the end of your move, you have supply on your next move. It does not matter how surrounded you are. That means that you can get replacements to the unit. It means that the unit can fight at full strength in order to try and break out of an encirclement. So you can fix this one if you spot it before the end of the move. When you punch through the enemy line, and you absolutely should, look back to just make sure that your supply line is intact. This one is not. 4th Panzer has done fantastic. It's captured Bologoye. But the only supply route into Bologoye from the west comes through that little junction southeast of Leningrad. And that junction is not currently being protected. The Norwegian army needs to be 1 hex to the east. Then everything would be fine. And always check the whole route. So here, 2nd Panzer and 6th Army have swung round to do an envelopment of the enemy units in Bessarabia. Great. You're pinning down Soviet units so that they can't escape. And they can trace to the rail line nearby. There's no enemy units around. But they can't get their lines all the way back to Germany. Why? Well, the Soviet 26th Infantry is blocking the supply line just west of Lvov, and the unit at Brest is blocking the supply line there. Now notice, this isn't affecting 2nd Infantry or 1st Panzer, despite the fact that they are using the same supply line, and that's because they can go overland on hex 2838 and then back to the supply line that way. But 2nd Panzer and 6th Army are in a lot of trouble. Can you spot the issue with this one? I'll give you a moment to pause the video and take a look. What's the problem? Well, the Soviet 6th Infantry has had its supply route kept open by placing the first shock immediately to its east. It's surrounded, which would normally cut off supply, but if you stick a unit in, you can run the supply through the first shock. That's great. Except for hex 2758, northeast of the 2nd Panzer. That's the rail line they would then have to bring the supply back along, and that is cut there by an enemy zone of control. And this is a dumb one, because there's no reason at all that the 16th Soviet Infantry couldn't be positioned 1 hex to the east, in which case all 3 of these units would be in supply, which means you would be able to rebuild the first shock and the 6th Infantry, and none of them would suffer any penalties for being out of supply. This is a bad one. Losing 3 whole units to this effectively kills 2 of the units and costs you the counter-attack that you're setting up. This is a disastrous supply trap to have fallen into. So let me put in perspective just how bad this is. You'll remember that I did a probability video and I said that if you had a basic understanding of the probability, you'd be shifting your odds about 1 in 10 in every single combat you engage in for the entire game. Well, if you fall into a supply trap, you're shifting the odds on the combats with those units about 1 in 2 for every combat they engage in and for multiple combats. So in this case, you are having as much effect as running 30 combats where you know that you are better than your opponent at calculating the odds. You will have squandered an entire year's worth of advantage on understandings of probability with 1 supply trap. And you'll have cost the Soviets 2 points of national will. There was no particularly good reason for them to lose. Units can also fall out of supply due to subtle changes in the line, even if the unit hasn't moved. So, take the German 8th Infantry in the centre of this picture. It was in supply last round. The line is basically in the same place it was in the last round. Yet now it finds itself out of supply. Why? Well, there's no supply line immediately to its rear. It has to take its supply either to the northwest or to the southwest. And 4th Guard is just 1 hex away from where it was the last round, which means suddenly the link to the southwest has been broken. So this is an example of how you've got to be careful as you kind of defensively retreat back, that especially in poor weather or severe weather, it's very easy for units to fall out of supply and not be noticed because of subtle changes in the line. Now again, Friendly cities protect supply lines. This looks like it's a supply trap, and it looks like Africa Corps is isolated. Africa Corps is not isolated. It has a friendly city adjacent to it. It can actually retreat into that friendly city if it's attacked by Western Desert Force. It can't if it's attacked by British Expeditionary Force on its own. Western Desert Force is not in a supply trap either. It can draw supply through Cairo to the 4th Convoy. So, friendly cities protect supply lines. But they can also get in the way. This is quite subtle, this one. 1st Canadian is out of supply at Dijon, up in France. Take a look, pause the video if you need to, and try and work out why it's unable to draw supply from any of the Allied convoys. It's on a supply line. The supply line is not immediately interfered with by any German units. And that supply line can trace back to 2 different sets of Allied convoys. It can go back to the convoys that are around Marseille in southern France. It can go back to Italy and to the convoys that are there. But the German 1st Garrison is cutting the supply line at hex 3416 that goes back to Marseille. And here's the subtle one that caught the person out in this game. Milan has not actually been conquered. Remember, Italy is usually an Axis power. And I think what's happened is that the player just hasn't registered Milan because there's no counter on it to indicate that there's anything going on there. No supply can go through Milan, and Milan is a junction in northern Italy. Ergo, no supply can get to Dijon. And thus, the 1st Canadian is out of supply. In this particular game, 1st Canadian then got blown up on the next round because it got surrounded, and the -2 on combat is just lethal combined with an isolate, which suddenly meant that advance, Dijon, was lost, and the Allies had to recapture it again. Okay, here's another Alps one. Can you spot the supply trap here and avoid it? This one's another one of these quite fun, subtle ones. Take a moment and pause the video if you have to. Okay, I'm hoping you all got this. 12th Air Force is not a ground unit. And it's not a friendly city. So 12th Air Force is not blocking the enemy zone of control to keep that supply route open. US 5th Army is in supply. The UK 10th Garrison is in supply. They're tracing back to immediately behind them. The 7th Army is in supply as well, because it can trace 2 hexes back to where the UK fighter force is based. But the 8th Army, the UK 8th Army, northwest of Munich, it can only trace 2 hexes, and then it has to have got to a supply line. And unfortunately, the supply line southwest of Munich isn't open. So even though it can trace into Munich, even though there is a friendly unit southwest of Munich, the friendly unit is not a ground unit, so it can't hold the supply open. And yes, 8th Army dropped out of supply. And yes, 8th Army got blown up. And Munich got recaptured. And the Allied breakthrough was squandered as a result of this supply trap. Here's a fun little one. I've seen this happen quite a bit on historical setups, that the German player is particularly aggressive on the southeastern front with their allies, and the result of their aggression is that they leave a Soviet unit somewhere around Cernauti, and that unit isn't properly pinned down and can walk through. In this case, the 12th Soviet Infantry went and captured Bucharest. And that's inconvenient. The Germans had to send their 11th Infantry round to recapture Bucharest. But take a closer look. That's right. They recaptured Bucharest, but they didn't reopen the supply line. The 12th Infantry is blocking the supply lines that go west out of Bucharest. It's blocking the junction that connects to the supply lines that go east out of Bucharest. The rule is you have to draw a line to a city in your home country. Romanian units have to draw supply lines to cities in Romania. The only cities in Romania are Bucharest and Constanta only draws a line to Bucharest. In other words, Bucharest is the only place that can supply Romanian units at full supply. And unless the southwestern route is open, which in this case it isn't because there are neutral countries in the way, all of the Romanian units go out of supply at the end of the turn. Which means they can't be involved in the advance, which means that they can be relatively easily killed. And the 11th Infantry had to go back anyway. So look out for this one with your minor powers. The supply of minor powers can be cut off even if the supply of German units is not. So certain positions tend to turn up again and again. And there's actually a question over whether or not you could usefully produce a sort of statistical analysis of what supply traps are, and that might inform decisions about where you place your defensive lines.
Through analysis of thousands of recorded gunfights, the cleric has determined that the geometric distribution of antagonists in any gun battle is a statistically predictable element.
The gun cutter treats the gun as a total weapon, each fluid position representing a maximum kill zone, inflicting maximum damage on the maximum number of opponents, while keeping the defender clear of the statistically traditional trajectories of return fire.
By the rote mastery of this art, your firing efficiency will rise by no less than 120%. The difference of a 63% increase to lethal proficiency.
For the moment, I'm going to concentrate on a couple that turn up very frequently. Let's begin with the Dnepropetrovsk Trap. And I've illustrated this by marking some of the information onto this position. The Panzer is attacking Dnepropetrovsk and it wants to capture it. And this is entirely normal. That ultimately is the target. It's the way you get... You have to go through that town or Kiev to get supply to the other side of the river, which you need to do in order to begin your advance on Kharkov. So these situations are very common. But the Soviet units are cutting all of the road and rail links that connect 1st Panzer. And here's where the subtlety often causes people to fall into a supply trap. 1st Panzer is still in supply, and that's because it can take its supply overland back to a part of the supply chain that is not being cut at 3247. But if it forces a retreat at Dnepropetrovsk and moves in, it then falls out of supply unless the German units secure the critical hexes, which I'm marking. The really important one is 3248, which is northwest of the 37th Infantry. That's the one that tends to cause problems. It's one you need to remember. The reason it's an issue is because of that piece of swampy land just above the mouth of the river. That usually allows a Soviet unit to safely hold that position, at least until after the Germans break through. The Paris Trap. Battle of France in 1940 has a lot of Paris traps in it. 1st Panzer is out of supply. Can you see why? There is no coastal road in France. And because of the Maginot Line, there's nothing coming through Alsace-Lorraine. All of the supply goes into and out of Paris, which means you have to get your supply into Paris and then back out on the other side. 1st Panzer can't do that because Hex 3013 to the west of Paris is being interfered with by the French infantry. The German infantry immediately to the east doesn't need to go through Paris. It's still close enough to Calais to draw its supply overland to there. 2nd Panzer is fine because the 4th Infantry is holding the supply line for it. And these turn up a lot. Here it's the British Expeditionary Force, which has fallen out of supply. It needs to draw its supply through Paris, because it's too far from Le Havre to simply draw the supply overland across the coast. Now, this is a particularly dumb one, because all the British have to do to avoid this is rebase first convoy to Calais, and then it would only need to draw its supply to Calais. But it catches people out. Can you see the problem in this one? Take a good look. See if you can work out where the problem has arisen here. Would you be able to fix it? Okay, so it's still about the fact that everything has to move through Paris, but it's also about distance. 2nd Panzer, 18th Infantry, and everything north of that is okay, because they can just go overland back to Hex 3015, and then that can go into Paris and back out through Calais to provide supply. But the 2nd Infantry and the 16th, south of Dijon, are in trouble. They can't go overland, they have to follow supply lines. And those look fine, because they can go into Dijon, then they can go back from there, but they're cut at Hex 3115, southeast of Paris, because the location isn't being guarded by a unit. And again, it's this that's deceptive. 2nd Panzer, 18th Infantry, everybody who was on the Dijon line and above was fine on the previous turn, so the player is lulled into a false sense of security that the supply situation is okay, and they press on south of Dijon. But it's not, because of that single hex. The moment you move south of Dijon, you need that hex to be open to get back to Paris. Let's talk about Moscow. If you want to take Moscow, and you should want to take Moscow, but the Soviets should not let you do so, then you need to do really well. More than anything, you need to take Yaroslav. The town Yaroslav, northeast of Moscow, is the last route the Soviets can get reinforcements in. As long as there's a Soviet unit touching Moscow, you are not going to take it, because you're not going to get an isolate bonus. And you need the isolate bonus on top of air superiority and tanks and all sorts of things, and a rolling assault and a little bit of luck. But the only way to supply Yaroslav is to control Moscow. So this isn't really a supply trap. This is more that the supply problem helps the Soviets. You have to take Yaroslav, but if you take Yaroslav, the unit that does it is going to fall out of supply, which is going to mean that the unit is in trouble. There are actually quite a few choke points on the Russian front like this. There's choke points all the way across the board, and this is where I thought, going forward, it's very interesting to make a statistical analysis and to look, where do people fall into supply traps? Because usually supply traps, like the various ones I showed you of the Alps, are the result of choke points. There's only one supply route that crosses the Alps from Italy to Germany. It's very, very easy to fall foul of a supply trap when there's only one supply route. Likewise, there are 4 fairly critical points in advances in the Soviet Union. Points where all of the supply has to come through a relatively small number of hexes. Dnepropetrovsk and Kiev, obviously. You need to get control of those in order to move on to Kharkov. The region between Bologoye and Leningrad, very similar problems. Everything depends on that junction in between the two. It's quite hard to shift the Soviets from there. As long as the Soviets hold that position, it's virtually impossible to advance any further. I mean, yes, you can break through and take Bologoye, but the unit will then drop out of supply, which either opens it up for a counterattack or just simply deprives it of the movement points and the combat factors that it needs to actually continue attacking, so it halts the advance. Moscow itself is a choke point. Everything you will see spider webs into Moscow and then comes back out, which means you need to have control over Moscow in order to push on to the northeast. As long as you don't, it's very hard to make progress. Stalingrad is also a choke point. You will notice that the 3 supply lines that are coming to the air congregate at Stalingrad. You can supply German units just fine if they're attacking Stalingrad. The moment they've taken it, and what they actually want to do is press on that little bit further and push the Soviet units away from the other side of the Volga, that becomes very difficult. It becomes very easy for the units to drop out of supply. So, here endeth the lesson for the day. Supply traps are the most common mistake in the game. The difference that they make is enormous. If you can avoid falling into a supply trap at any point in your game, that's probably enough, if you're not facing an incredibly experienced player, to turn the game in your favour. However, it's actually quite hard to do. I'm going to tell you now, I have yet to play a scenario of any length in which both my opponent and myself have avoided supply traps. Every single game I have played, every single player in the game has fallen into a supply trap at least once. In most games, players fall into 1 to 3 supply traps every year. So across the course of a full main event, a player is probably going to fall into something like 10 to 20 supply traps. If you can avoid doing that, you will be a better player. So remember, the single most important thing in your improvement as a player, stop making mistakes.